I'm Christine Colucci, CEO of R plus M, and joining me is Edward Baldwin. He is our principal and our strategy practice lead here at R plus M, and we're excited to be here.
We are.
Yeah, well, I want to begin with an idea that may challenge how many organizations think about growth. Sometimes a company doesn't lose the sale. They never actually become a serious option in the first place. That's a little bit harder pill to swallow because they just don't make the buyer shortlist. And in the case of the buyer, they have already formed an opinion about who feels credible, who feels relevant, who feels safe enough to consider. And if you're not on that buyer shortlist, your company is not under consideration, and that's a big deal. Edward and I approach this problem from two different but deeply connected sides of the business. So Edward focuses on the market and the buyer and the commercial impact of how brands earn trust, what builds confidence before a formal buying process begins, why organizations make the shortlist while others never become serious contenders. And then my work begins inside the organization. So I focus on leadership alignment and the operating environment leaders create. And when I say leadership alignment, I don't mean that leaders agree about everything. I mean they share a clear understanding of where the company is going, what matters most, and how decisions should be made. So our two perspectives kind of belong together because revenue may be generated in the market, but many of the conditions that support or undermine revenue are actually created in the business. So today, Edward's going to take us outside the organization, talk to us about how buyers begin building their short lists long before a formal sales process even begins. And I'm going to take us out inside the organization and show how leadership decisions shape the experiences and signals those buyers receive. And together, we're going to connect the two sides of growth because long before a buyer purchases, they have already begun deciding who they trust. And long before that, the company has already created many of the conditions influencing that decision. So with that, Edward, let's start with what's happening on the buyer side before an
Thanks,
organization
Christine. You've
even
got,
knows. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
you got me all fired up. Yes. So, what Christine's pointing to, this key idea is this inside and outside of the business, because, that gap between those two things is where ultimately a buyer is going to be shaping those beliefs. And when a company sort of gets their, opens their eyes to this difference in the role of the inside and outside perspective, that's when they can start to understand a little bit better what Christine teed up at the beginning of the conversation around, not just sort of did we win or lose, but were we considered for the opportunity or not. So, like we said, put a point on it. Buying begins, for practical purposes, long before anyone raises their hand in the traditional sense. Um, I will expound on that a bit if you'll let me, if you'll bear with me. Um, so I think this is sort of something I talk to my clients about a lot, especially in the B2B space, that the buying journey that we know and focus on and that's so key to our revenue and so central to our understanding of the world, often that vision's incomplete. And I maybe on a day where I'm feeling a little less charitable, I call this a critical blind spot. But I think it's an understandable pattern. But the key thing to know here is that by the time that prospect is visiting your website or has downloaded your white paper or has reached out to sales, they tend to be a lot further along in their decision making than kind of a pure view of our sales funnel really would have us believe. And that's important because before that formal buying process begins, the buyer's not inactive, right? We talk about active and inactive. They are doing things. There is activity. A buyer hearing about you or seeing something that you've published or, coming across some thought leadership you've put out or seeing you mentioned in a source they trust. All this sort of cloud of things. No single one of them is going to lock anything down. It's going to drive that decision. But over time, taken together, they do start to help that buyer, and I think importantly, sometimes even kind of subconsciously, start to form early judgment about you before they are technically a buyer from the perspective of our revenue model. They're asking themselves and they're starting to recognize and put together, does this company align with the problems I'm trying to solve day to day? Do they seem credible in the things they say and the proof they show? Um, would I stick my neck out for them and recommend them to my colleagues when we actually do convene that buying group? These are very important questions for a buyer to be answering. But much of these questions and answers are happening really before marketing knows that that buyer exists, or really before sales sees an opportunity. When that buyer does kind of finally enter that pipeline, they're almost never starting from zero. And I think we all know that intuitively, sort of in a general sense and sort of specific to our own buying behaviors, right? I think from our perspective, perhaps a more helpful and valuable way to understand what happens during a buying process is they're trying to confirm or challenge an opinion they kind of already had, a choice they already wanted to make. Um, again, nobody's going to continue, is going to evaluate every option available to them. There's just not enough time in the day. That's not how human beings work. So um, I'll throw to Christine here for a second. I know I'm going on, but I think the important thing here is that buyers are also, not just researching earlier. It's that they're sort of looking to kind of resolve uncertainty. I think that's a much better model than sort of just pure learning.
Yeah.
And they're trying to do that resolving before they're really evaluating a company or raising their hand. That's the blind spot. And I think that's really where some of the most commercially important decisions are being made. And that's what
Yeah.
we're going to focus on.
Yeah, yeah. And if I were to give an example, because I know we have big attendance from my HR peeps today, which I love that. I liken it to purchasing an HRIS system. You know who your top three people are. Maybe you look around to see if there's somebody from a price point perspective or something new and emerging from an AI perspective. But that's usually a big purchase, big undertaking, or any kind of the systems that get used in HR, review systems, all of that. You kind of know who you would use if you're not using already an enterprise system within your organization. So
Yeah. And so Christine teed up this whole conversation, and I think sort of why we're all here was around this idea of a short list. And I think everybody kind of went with the flow on that. I think we have an intuitive understanding what that means, but we want to get a little bit more specific and rigorous of our definition of that because ultimately that is how we unlock the commercial value within this short list is by being specific about the terms. Um, I think, again, some psychology comes in here. Buyers are not building a short list just to make purchasing easier. They're building that short list to reduce risk.
yeah,
Every company that's on that short list has cleared this risk threshold in their brain. The company feels credible. It feels relevant. It feels safe enough. Again, I mentioned this before, for somebody to raise their hand and say, hey guys, I think this is the one we should go with. And I use the word feel. We're not really even talking about objective facts right now. Those kind of come into play earlier and have an indirect application. So when we talk about this idea of the short list, it becomes commercially significant, right? Because by the time that buying process, that formal buying process begins, really a meaningful and quantifiably valuable amount of the market and market share has already been allocated to those companies that are on that short list.
yeah. And what I hear you saying is sort of like confidence,
Yeah.
right? Like buyers
Vibes.
need to have confidence in you, and that's how I would liken a purchase like an HRIS system. You have to have confidence. You're not putting yourself out in front of your peers to say this is the one. And that applies to all of the companies that you work for as well. When you're selling to your buyers, that level of confidence is going to influence where you fall on that short list or not, right? And from my experience, confidence isn't something marketing creates, right? Marketing can communicate your story, sales can reinforce your value, but confidence is earned through experience, and it's created every time a customer interacts with your organization. And for my HR peeps, so I love her here today, every time it interacts with your people, right? So every time an employee represents your company, every time a leader makes a decision that shapes how the business operates. In other words, confidence is kind of built long before someone ever becomes a customer, right? Which raises like an important question. If confidence is what earns a place on the buyer shortlist, where does that confidence actually come from? And that's what I'd like to spend our time on. So, all right. So continuing this on confidence, right? If it's earned before the buying process begins, then we need to understand how and where buyers are collecting that evidence that creates that confidence. So that evidence comes from the signals your organization sends every day. Some of those signals are intentional, your website, your marketing, your sales conversations, your thought leadership. But many of the signals shaping buyer confidence are not actually created intentionally. They're created by how quickly someone responds. Think about this for yourself as well. How quickly somebody responds has an important factor for how you think about them, right? How clearly people are communicating, what different departments tell the same story, whether the experience feels consistent from one interaction to the next, whether the company does what it says it'll do. Organizations are communicating constantly, whether they intend to or not. And most of that communication is not created by marketing. It's created by the way the organization operates. So the question isn't whether your company is sending signals. The question is whether those signals consistently reinforce the experience you want your buyers and your customers and your employees and your partners to have. And when they do reinforce one another, they create confidence. And when they contradict one another, they create doubt. And over time, those accumulated signals shape what people believe about your company. And this is where the brand enters the conversation, perhaps not in the way that most organizations think about it, because brand is uniquely actually suited to unify a leadership team, to unify an organization, to create signals that actually demonstrate that consistency that's needed to build confidence.
Yeah, and if I can jump in, Christine, I
Yes.
think that's brand is a great bridge between these kind of two competing ideas of sort of what's going on in your company and what the buyer is experiencing, because those are different things, but they meet in the middle. Christine was talking about all of the signals the entire business sort of sends inadvertently or on purpose, and that's all well and good. I think that's a great way to think about what we are producing from inside the company. But from the buyer's perspective, they're not thinking about signals. They're just having an experience. They're seeing evidence of who you are, evidence that the claims you make are believable, evidence, that again, that you tell a coherent story that they can trust, that you will not be creating unnecessary risk or doubt for them. So, we're very big here. We're here to let marketing off the hook because none of these things are things that marketing alone can control. The confidence that Christine's talking about, it's organization wide, is something that gets accumulated again from the entire organization. Like she said, every interaction that a person has, no matter with whom, is either going to strengthen the case for you or weaken it.
Yeah, I would say for the most part throughout my career, I've been responsible for helping organizations grow. I actually came up through HR, integrating acquisitions, improving ops, leading people, and preparing companies for transaction. And in all of those environments, the brand wasn't a marketing initiative. It was like the North Star for how leadership aligned itself to influence and how those organizations actually performed. Brand wasn't what a company says about itself, right? It's what people and customers and partners and other stakeholders repeatedly experience, right? And you'll hear this theme throughout. Marketing generally understands this, right? But other members of your leadership team, other operators don't always recognize exactly the direct correlation that their decisions have inside the organization to the experience that customers are having with your organization. And that's where this disconnect often begins. Leadership may be completely sincere about what it wants their organization to stand for, but intent alone does not create an actual experience, right? The experience is created by the priorities that the leadership team reinforces, the behaviors that they reward, the decisions that they make, where they spend budget, the systems that they put in place. And when those things support a stated promise, people experience the company as leadership intended, right? When they don't, the organization communicates something really different. So let me give you a few examples, right? So if leadership is saying we're customer focused,
Mhm.
but internally, priorities constantly outweigh customer needs. Customers eventually feel that, as do employees. You're not walking the walk, right? And you don't have to be a customer focused organization to be successful in your category. You might not need to be. But if you're going to declare it, you need to act it, right? The other one that's kind of common that comes up a lot is we empower our people. And then every decision has to escalate up, right? So employees are experiencing obviously something way different if you're saying that you're empowering them, but you're not actually empowering them in the experience that they're having.
Yeah, just to add on once again, sort of my job of standing next to and standing up for my marketing friends. Marketing can certainly help buyers recognize things that are true about you, but marketing cannot make things true about your organization, right? And I think that's a big misalignment in terms of expectations from leadership when leadership says, brand is a marketing problem. Marketing owns brand. Um, because, like Christine's saying, when that operating reality uh, on the upside reinforces the market story, what do we see? We see less uncertainty in what the buyer experiences, and vice versa. And when we talk about that connection between the operating reality and the experience and how it leads um, to preference and shortlist inclusion, all of a sudden this kind of causal chain to this commercial value we're talking about, how brand has dollars and cents value on the P&L, starts to be a little more clear and focused.
Yeah. So, every organization I've worked with has genuinely wanted to create a great customer experience, right? They want to build a strong culture or grow exceptional businesses, right? Nobody sets out to create confusion or inconsistency, and yet many are unintentionally doing that. And the reason is because organizations are really judged by their intentions, right? You can intend to have a great customer experience, but they communicate how they operate through their experiences. So you can say, again, it's walk the walk, right? You have to actually do the things that help your customer feel as if they're having a great experience. And more so, you have to understand what they need to have that great experience. It can't also be what you want them to have, right? So over time, those experiences then become the reputation people associate your company with.
Yeah, and just to jump in, I think another perspective here that Christine's been teeing up of this as an enterprise lift, um, with intentions. If each function of your organization is operating well, but they are not operating together, you get almost the same effect as if they were all fighting. You get that inconsistency because buyers do not see or particularly care about your org chart. They only experience the consequences that org chart creates in terms of the experience that those customers are having. And, as Christine said, a well-aligned organization, across the board feels consistent. It can't help but be otherwise. And again, vice versa. When you lack this alignment, ultimately the organization is going to feel unpredictable depending on who you talk to that day. And that unpredictability is expensive because buyers interpret that as risk. Yeah. And in the market, so then, consistency isn't really just about kind of operational quality. It becomes competitive advantage. And sort of this is the drum that we are
Yeah.
always beating, that these leadership and organizational ideas that I think we all understand are not just sort of management theory. They have real commercial impact in the market.
Yeah, how leadership treats its people and how its people feel and experience an organization is ultimately going to have a major impact on customer experience. So
Yeah. And let's talk
let's
about
talk
that
about
cost.
drift.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
know what
let's
to
talk about
say.
drift. Yeah. So drift, this is probably my favorite word when it comes to what we're talking about, right? Because when people hear the phrase leadership misalignment, they often imagine conflict and they picture executives arguing in a boardroom or leaders pulling or pulling in opposite directions. And I think that's all real, but that's actually not what I see most often. I've seen a few boardroom brawls, but what I see is more drift. That's what I'm calling it. And it's much more subtle. So it happens when you have good leaders. Every leadership team has a mix, right, of people. Some are good, some are not good. But what happens when good leaders begin making reasonable decisions without a shared reference point, um, you end up having drift, right? So again, let me say that again. Good leaders, reasonable decisions, but they don't have a shared reference point, right? So they're making it based on the experience they've had for the last 20 years at the company they're at right now, but you're all very different than what you were 20 years ago. Or they're making the decisions based off the experience of tenure they've had at a company before they joined you. You hired them for their experience. They want to exert their experience, but you have a completely different culture and maybe a slightly different customer base. And so without a shared reference point, those reasonable decisions um, are going to create the drift that I'm talking about. Because no one's trying to like undermine strategy. No one's intentionally working against the business. In these scenarios, those examples I explained, they're showing up to do their job, right? Everyone believes they're doing the right thing, and that's what makes drift so difficult to recognize. You kind of feel it intuitively, but it doesn't happen all at once. It happens like one decision at a time, one acceptance to the strategy, one priority that quietly moves ahead of another, one customer request that seems important, but it's not aligned, an opportunity that's too good to pass up, but deviates from the plan, one meeting where a decision gets made that isn't fully understood by those who execute it. That's a really big one, and we'll probably come back around to that. Individually, none of these decisions seem significant, but collectively, when they're happening on a consistent basis, collectively, everybody's drifting in different places. So eventually sales is making decisions based on one definition of success. Operations is optimizing for another, and marketing is reinforcing yet another. Customer success, potentially even another. All slight different variations, sometimes big deviant variations. And leadership believes everyone's executing the same strategy, but each team has kind of slowly developed its own version of what success looks like, and that's drift. And the longer it goes unnoticed, the harder it becomes to correct, because everyone can point to reasonable decisions that kind of got them to where they're at.
Yeah, and again, I tell you this all the time, Christine, but
Yeah.
I love this idea of drift. It's such a powerful idea for me to kind of come to conversations with, because while it's subtle, but what she's saying, it doesn't look
Mm-hmm.
like a boardroom brawl most often. The longer it goes along, you look around and you say, all of a sudden we are so far apart and we don't know how we got here.
Yeah.
And I think that really just captures something that we see all the time. But getting back into my lane, we can
Yeah.
talk about organizational drift. Your buyers do not experience it in this way. They will experience it from their perspective. What they're going to see is things like changing expectations of what you deliver, uneven proof coming from you about what you're substantiating, and just ultimately a company that, we go back to vibes, right? A company that feels less focused, less predictable, all things that are aligned with a risk profile. Um, from the outside, from the customer, drift just looks like inconsistency. And again, that inconsistency is working against your ability to build that confidence, making that confidence harder and more expensive to earn, right? Maybe you just have to work
Mm-hmm.
harder to get the same level of confidence. And again, that has revenue implications. And sort of speaking of cost within the company, that drift rings the cash register in other ways, right, Christine?
Yeah. So there's actually it's a tax. I call it a tax when you're misaligned, when your leadership team is not aligned. This is where drift stops being a leadership conversation and starts becoming a business performance conversation. So because drift has costs, right? It shows up everywhere. Projects get repeated because teams weren't working from the same understanding. Meetings multiply because leaders are trying to reconnect people who have unintentionally drifted apart. This is a big one. When it's starting to happen, you'll start to see multiple layers of meetings. Approvals increase because trust in decision making begins to erode. People are hesitant because they no longer confident about what success looks like. And in this scenario, your best people, when they start to be in a situation, your really good top performers, when they don't feel like they can make decisions, they don't really understand the direction of where things are going, they're not going to stick around. And so there's also a people cost to this, and a continuity cost when people move on, which all of you know pretty well. But and then customers begin having this different experience depending upon who they interact with. If you're having a lot of turnover in people, this is going to be particularly sensitive because they're meeting new people all the time. The organization starts working harder to achieve its results, and eventually revenue becomes more expensive to generate because retention becomes more difficult for both employees and customers, and margins begin to shrink. There's pressure to discount. So what's interesting is that none of these outcomes usually feel connected to one another. Organizations experience them as separate problems. Some of you will experience them as turnover. Turnover is your problem, but it isn't, right? Because they're also symptoms of the very same underlying issue, and they're paying what I think is the hidden tax that results from leadership misalignment.
So what happens when leadership looks around one day and says, "Gee, I sure am paying a lot of tax right now on this drift." They do something pretty predictable. I think we might all be able to relate, right? They add more process, right? More, more approval steps. Let's get a new dashboard stood up. We need more reporting. And, not to be dismissive, those things are measures that can
Yeah,
improve control, right? Which, if you have no control, it's a good place to start. But, and again, I think it's probably something you've all seen yourselves. Uh, the answer is rarely process, right? We're talking about complex issues, and very rarely can complexity be solved with more complexity. What is the antidote? The only way forward is again an effort, a deliberate effort to gain and sustain a greater strategic clarity.
yeah, that's right, Edward. And one one question I get asked a lot is, do I have the right people? And it's actually one of the most common questions I get from CEOs and leadership teams. And sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes you don't have the right people. But much more often, they do not have a people problem. They have a decision problem, right? And when I hear that question, I usually challenge the assumption behind this. And feel free to use this when you are working with your team, because you're going to get challenged all the time about who's not any good. But I believe the real issue is rarely talent and capability or experience. Those are not the issues that are on the table. It's almost always how decisions are being made across leaders, teams, and moments. And this is where I would start the assessment, right? Because you might not have the right people. That might be true, but you sort of have to test that hypothesis, right? You won't know until you fix the environment around them, right? Or maybe better said, until you give them a clear plan to operate from. Because good people can only make consistently good decisions when leadership creates consistent decision criteria, right? What are those decisions? What would you expect? What are the criteria? And, when leaders aren't operating from that same understanding of what matters and what success looks like and how decisions should be made, everyone will start to make those best decisions with the information they have. And I've talked about this earlier, right? If you don't have a shared reference point, your new people, your legacy people, your any people are not going to know, who are we now? Who are we now? Where are we focused right now? And what are we trying to accomplish? What is our identity? They want to support it. And it's also a way to get them excited to be part of something moving forward. It's a unifying opportunity because they want to be supportive, but they're just supporting different versions right now based on who they talk to on the leadership team, and that's the drift again.
Yeah, and let's keep our split screen going, right? Christine's looking at
Yeah,
this problem from the inside. I'll take us back to the outside, because while Christine is laying out all these reasons and ways and good intentions that these things can happen internally, and things that can be explained as everybody is doing their job and nobody on my team is a bad performer, buyers are not going to investigate why your company feels inconsistent. They don't have the time to do that. They don't. That's just not realistic, right? We don't get that pass. They are simply going to know what they experience, and they're going to know that they are feeling more uncertainty about this option, and they're going to move on to the one that makes them feel less doubt and risk. So, um, again, what we're talking about is this difficult thing for organizations is that they almost never see this drift kind of while they're living it.
yeah.
Um, except the customers. The customers do. They do get it in real time. And so hopefully there's some feedback loop, but usually not enough. And going back to this idea of drift and good intentions, uh, Christine, I wanted to tee up that example you have about the RFP if you don't mind sharing that one.
Yeah. Of course. Thanks for teeing that up. So we worked with a company. I want to be able to give you guys an example of drift. So we worked with a company that received an opportunity to pursue a large international RFP. And on paper, it looked really exciting. It was a recognized brand, a significant contract, the kind of opportunity that immediately gets everyone's attention.
Mhm.
There was just one problem. It was larger than the organization was built to deliver. It was in a geographic location where they had very little operational presence. And more importantly, it wasn't consistent with the company's stated growth strategy. But when something of that size appears, it's hard to ignore, right? Sales wants the revenue, marketing wants the visibility, leadership wants, they see the possibility, and ops is like immediately trying to figure out how are we actually going to make this work. But for several weeks, this client this is exactly what they were doing. And the organization shifted into response mode for this RFP. People delayed other priorities. Resources were reassigned. Meetings multiplied. Marketing changed focus. Operations diverted capacity. Sales pushed forward. Everyone worked incredibly hard, right? But the important part here is nothing about that decision was irrational. In fact, every department had a good reason for supporting it. Sales wanted to win the business, and ops wanted to prove they could deliver, and leadership wanted the feather in their cap. And individually, every decision made sense. Collectively, they didn't, because none of those decisions were measured against the same reference point. The question shouldn't have been, can we pursue this? It should have been, does this move us closer to the company we're trying to become? Because the answer to that would have been no, right? And saying no is actually strategic discipline. And instead, I call it the shiny penny. You got to get your eyes off the shiny penny. Focus is a big part of leadership alignment. And so the company unintentionally kind of taught itself something much more powerful, right? It taught itself that the plan was optional. Their strategic plan was optional. The strategy could be overridden by excitement, the next opportunity, the shiny penny. And once people begin to believe the plan is optional, they stop using it to make decisions. It's more drift. Drift it's not dramatic. It's subtle. And it happens one reasonable decision at a time, and until eventually everyone believes they're supporting the strategy while they're actually moving in completely different directions.
Yeah, and yes, Christine, that idea of strategic discipline is in a word the antidote for drift, or I guess it's the means, right? Is how do you
Yeah.
apply strategic discipline to decision making? And for us, at R plus M, our model, and just sharing that as an example here, is around this idea of right to win. Because like Christine was talking about in her example, taken one at a time, not every opportunity that comes across you is bad, particularly when you are trying to hit quarterly numbers or trying to grow a business. It becomes very tempting. Um, but at the same time, every opportunity shapes and in many ways tests the company's overall direction and where you come out on the other side of that. And, sort of what does it look like to apply kind of at a high level without getting too in the weeds, this strategic discipline? It's going from asking yourself, like Christine said, can we win it? To should this opportunity be part of who we are becoming? And that's a much more nuanced question. It requires a lot more consensus and not just who got the RFP in their inbox and is going to run with it. And I think I think that's why I like this example, is it kind of makes hopefully some of these concepts we're talking about real in the stuff that we kind of see every day.
Yeah. And the decision criteria in this scenario is something that the leadership team would establish, because it may very well be the responsibility of one of the leaders to make that call, RFP, yes or no. And if there's a gray area, right, in this instance, it was really red, but if there's a gray area, then, maybe they have, a little bit more of an informal or formal discussion about, hey, I'm thinking about this. It's really gray. What are we thinking? And they're going to get some buy-in from their peers or not. So it's just an opportunity to, I don't want to say that, that in doing some of this, that there's a lot of checking in per se, because there's a lot of opportunity to delegate and allow folks on the leadership team and down through the organization. That's what you want to strive for, to be able to move the needle. You just have to have some experience working from this shared decision criteria.
Yeah. Okay. And, we talked about this before, but I think, again, this is just such a valuable mental model to keep in mind to help start to make some of the sense of this and connect, again, that customer experience and revenue with all that stuff that's going on internally with your leadership. As I think we've said, your customers are not doing the work of evaluating every aspect of your company individually, right? That just is not reasonable. It's not happening. What they are evaluating, and sort of the hit or miss, is a single experience, maybe even brought down to a single impression. They expect that the promise that's made during the sales process up front is going to carry through implementation, even when even when they get handed off to somebody else potentially. They expect customer support to bring an understanding of the context of their initial purchase into those conversations, and they want billing, to treat them with as much care and enthusiasm as they received when they were being sold to. at any of these places, a weak handoff or just a single contradictory message is not going to just remain kind of quarantined in one department. It's going to change ultimately how the company, or sorry, how the customer judges the whole company.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why alignment across the business matters. When every function is operating from the same strategy, customers will experience consistency. And when they're not, customers begin noticing little things, right? So individually, those moments seem small. Collectively, they shape how people feel about doing business with your organization. And that's why I believe the brand isn't built in a single campaign. It's built in thousands of moments where an organization either delivers a consistent experience or it doesn't. And that's why leadership alignment matters so, so much, because leaderships don't just shape that business performance, they shape the experience every department creates and ultimately the experience every customer will remember with the decisions and directions of each member of the leadership team. And this is ultimately what affects your reputation in the market. Because one of the ways in which people get on the buyer shortlist is they ask a trusted peer. So it's not always within the company, it's within your peer network that you're asking. And I know many of you, if you were going to go out and buy an HRIS system, if you don't have your shortlist made, you're going to check in with a peer, or you might have your shortlist made and check in with a peer to see if there's one you didn't remember, or if there's one on the list you shouldn't keep anymore because maybe a few years and maybe they went down the train. So, uh, these experiences that your customers have are also in the market to your prospective customers. It's a holistic approach.
All right. So, Christine, you were talking about preference a minute ago and sort of how these impressions actually get shaped and sort of how we as operators and people who want our company to grow can start to influence these. I think everything we're talking about is pointing to this conclusion, right?
Yep.
Buyers are not looking for certainty because that's fleeting in this world, right? They're just looking for enough confidence to move forward with the decision that they have to make. They want confidence that you understand their problem. They want confidence that the stuff you say in your marketing is actually backed by your operations and your capabilities. They want to believe and trust that that experience that they're going to have after that sale is finished is gonna resemble the experience that they bought into initially. These are the things that ultimately create preference and that shortlist inclusion. Um, it's not because buyers have become less risk averse through this, but it's because you have done the work of reducing that uncertainty that they feel going in. Um, Something we like to say a lot is the buying process doesn't manufacture confidence with the buyer. It only reinforces confidence they already had.
Yeah. And it's just more evidence that leadership alignment matters so much because leadership begins creating those conditions long before buyers even know they're buying, right? Every decision that they make influences how employees make those decisions. And their employees are shaping those prospective customer experiences and actual customer experiences that are creating the reputation in the market. And those experiences either reinforce confidence or slowly diminish it. So over time, the consistency becomes confidence. Confidence becomes trust and trust becomes preference. And preference is what earns a place on the buyer's shortlist. And that's why, from our perspective, brand isn't simply something organizations communicate. It is something that they earn through the experience they consistently create. Every leadership decision is an opportunity to strengthen that experience or unintentionally weaken it. And over time, those moments compound. And that's how organizations become the companies buyers prefer when the buying process begins.
All right, Christine, we're wrapping it up here.
Mm-hmm.
I think, hopefully for everybody, we've successfully connected, those leadership decisions to, how buyers are forming preference and ultimately choosing their shortlist and making their decision. I wanted to throw a question your way,
Okay.
kind of from the operator's perspective. That's you. What separates the companies that kind of successfully sustain this alignment in a way that drives growth in the way we're talking about?
Yeah, I would say so I did come up through HR, so I love sharing that when I have my HR peoples on the go. I came up through HR, went through like chief people strategist into COO and now CEO, and have been in mostly private equity owned businesses, lots at M&A, all high growth environments. Some of them were turnaround high growth, lots and lots of growth, right? So from that perspective, one of the clearest lessons that I've learned is that the strongest companies don't necessarily have better strategies. Most companies have intelligent people and a reasonable plan. The difference is whether leadership can turn that plan into a shared way of operating. And do leaders agree on what matters most? Are they making decisions using the same priorities? Do employees understand how the strategy should influence the decisions that they make every day? Because a strategy sitting in a presentation does not create consistency. Leadership creates consistency by repeatedly reinforcing the strategy through its decisions, its priorities, its behaviors, where it invests. And when that happens, people don't have to improvise as often, right? They don't need every decision escalated. They can move with greater clarity and confidence. You can think about how that is for you in your own organization now. How comfortable and confident do you feel moving around and making the decisions that you have to make, and where do you feel like maybe somebody doesn't have your back, right? Because when you share a reference point for a company, when your leadership team has a shared reference point of what you're trying to accomplish, that is what makes leadership alignment possible. It's this shared decision criteria, this shared alignment. It turns that strategy into then consistent execution. That's the bridge between strategy and real life. And constant execution, consistent execution, I should say, becomes an experience. So employees experience it, current customers experience it, prospective customer experience it. And the market may never see the leadership alignment behind the company, but it will absolutely experience the results.
Yeah, and just to add on that, what will they see, right? From the buyer's
Yeah.
perspective, what do all these things look like? They look and feel like clarity. They look like credibility, and they instill confidence. So again, that's sort of what we were here to do today is try to establish that connection between, that operating system within the company and that short list inclusion, that preference, that advantage in the decision making and winning that actually happens in the market.
Yeah, that's right. So we began today with the idea that sometimes a company does not lose the sale. It never becomes a serious option in the first place. And by the time the buyer enters a formal buying process, they have already formed an opinion about which company feels credible, relevant, safe enough to consider. And that confidence is built over time through signals and experiences the organization consistently creates. So with that, I just wanted to share a couple of things. We put up Edward's QR code here if you want to schedule some one-on-one time with him. I put my email and my LinkedIn in the chat if you want to connect. And also, when I send out the recording of the meeting, I'll send a calendar invite. So, and you're welcome to connect on my calendar if you want to talk individually about what you have going on. I work very specifically with HR leaders on employee and leadership matters. So Edward does the outside piece. So depending upon what you have going on, that may help if you want to talk or whenever you might want to. But at R+M, we believe brand is much bigger than marketing. I hope we've laid that out for you. Brand is the experience an organization creates through the way it leads, operates, and communicates and delivers. So as I shared when we began, Edward and I kind of approached the work from two connected sides of the business. Edward helps those markets, buyers, opportunities that drive revenue and preference. So he's your best person to talk about those things. And then I work with leadership teams on alignment strategy, priorities, decision making, so the organization can consistently deliver that experience, its brand promises operationally. So with all that, what resonates?